The cruelest kind of revenge is pretending someone never mattered. The crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across the grand ballroom while camera flashes burst like tiny storms around Ethan Bennett as he stood confidently on the stage, smiling for investors, executives, and reporters who admired the man everyone called the rising star of Bennett Development. His tailored navy suit looked flawless, his handshake was practiced, and every laugh he offered sounded perfectly measured, but nothing in the room attracted more attention than the woman quietly stepping through the entrance alone. Claire Bennett wore a simple ivory dress that cost less than many guests had spent on a single bottle of wine that evening. She carried no designer purse, wore no glittering diamonds, and asked for nothing except the invitation that had arrived in her mailbox 3 weeks earlier with Ethan's signature printed neatly across the bottom. A few conversations stopped as guests recognized her face. Some whispered her name. Others exchanged curious smiles before pretending not to stare. Claire ignored every glance. Her heels echoed softly across the marble floor as a string quartet played near the stage, their music elegant enough to hide the sharp edge of the gossip spreading through the room. Ethan noticed her almost immediately. For the briefest second, surprise crossed his face before disappearing beneath another polished smile. Vanessa Cole, his glamorous fiancée, leaned closer and followed his gaze. She tilted her head with amused disbelief before letting out a quiet laugh that several nearby guests eagerly joined. Claire continued walking without changing her pace. She stopped beside a cocktail table near the back of the ballroom, choosing a place far from the spotlight. A waiter offered her sparkling water. She thanked him with a gentle smile, the only genuine smile anyone had given that young employee all evening. On stage, Ethan lifted his microphone. "Tonight," he announced, "is about celebrating new beginnings." The audience applauded warmly. His eyes drifted toward Claire again. "It's always important," he continued with carefully chosen words, "to leave the past exactly where it belongs." More applause followed. Vanessa's smile widened as if she understood every hidden meaning behind his sentence. Several people turned toward Claire, waiting for embarrassment to appear across her face. Instead, she simply lifted her glass, took a quiet sip, and watched the stage with calm eyes that revealed nothing. That silence somehow made the whispers louder. One investor leaned toward another. "I heard she lost everything after the divorce." Another shrugged. "Looks like he definitely traded up." Vanessa eventually approached Claire herself, her expensive heels clicking confidently across the marble. "I almost didn't recognize you," she said sweetly enough for nearby guests to overhear. "I'm surprised you came." Claire looked at her politely. "I was invited." Vanessa smiled without warmth. "Well, I hope tonight gives you the closure you need." Claire nodded once. "Maybe it will." The answer sounded so peaceful that Vanessa hesitated before walking away. Across the ballroom, Ethan accepted congratulations, unaware that Claire had never come searching for closure. She had come because another invitation, delivered by a different envelope and carrying the name of one of the most respected law firms in America, had instructed her to be in this very building at exactly 7:30. She had told no one about that letter. Not Ethan. Not the curious guests. Not even the waiter who noticed she had barely touched her drink. As the ballroom lights dimmed and the giant presentation screen slowly illuminated behind the stage, Claire quietly reached into her purse and brushed her fingertips against the unopened cream-colored envelope resting inside. It remained perfectly sealed, waiting for the moment when everything everyone believed about the forgotten ex-wife would begin to unravel. Claire did not look toward the stage again. Instead, her eyes settled on the polished marble beneath her feet, where reflections of expensive shoes crossed in every direction. Years ago, she had stood beside Ethan at events just like this one, welcomed with warm smiles, introduced as the woman who had believed in him before anyone else did. Back then, the ballroom lights had felt softer, and every handshake had carried hope instead of judgment. Ethan had not always worn custom suits or spoken with the effortless confidence that now impressed investors. There had been a time when he worked from a cramped apartment, spreading blueprints across their tiny kitchen table, while Claire balanced the monthly bills with a calculator that seemed to produce impossible numbers. She had worked long hours at a neighborhood bookstore, then hurried home carrying groceries in reusable bags because every dollar mattered. Some nights they shared one bowl of soup between them, laughing as they promised each other that success would eventually arrive. Claire had believed every word. When Ethan doubted himself before meetings, she stayed awake rehearsing presentations with him until sunrise. When banks rejected another loan application, she reminded him that one refusal did not define a lifetime. When his first development project finally secured funding, he celebrated by placing a modest silver necklace around her neck and whispering that everything they built would always belong to both of them. She kept that necklace for years, long after the promises had quietly disappeared. Success changed slowly at first, almost too gradually to notice. Business dinners became more frequent. Weekend vacations were replaced with networking events. Ethan's phone never stopped vibrating, and every new opportunity demanded another sacrifice. Claire accepted each change because she believed marriage meant growing together, even when the road became difficult. Then unfamiliar names began appearing in conversations. New executives, exclusive clubs, private celebrations where spouses were apparently unnecessary distractions. Ethan insisted it was only business. Claire wanted to believe him because trust had once come as naturally as breathing. By the time she realized distance had replaced partnership, silence had already become the loudest sound inside their home. Entire evenings passed with barely a conversation. Their dining table remained perfectly set while untouched meals grew cold beneath the kitchen lights. One rainy afternoon, Ethan finally placed divorce papers on the counter with the same calm expression he used during business negotiations. He spoke about different goals, different futures, and the importance of moving forward. There were no dramatic arguments, no raised voices, just the quiet ending of promises that had once felt unbreakable. Claire signed her name with steady hands because she understood something Ethan never noticed. Love could disappear without destroying dignity. She packed only what belonged to her, folded the silver necklace into a small wooden box, and walked out carrying 2 suitcases that held far fewer possessions than memories. Friends quietly drifted toward Ethan, drawn by his growing influence. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls became rare. Rumors spread that Claire had depended on his success and simply failed to keep up with his new life. She never corrected anyone. Every misunderstanding became another stone she carried without complaint. Standing alone in the ballroom now, surrounded by people who believed they knew her story, Claire almost smiled at how confidently strangers filled empty spaces with false conclusions. None of them knew that the most important chapter of her life had begun only after she closed the front door of the marriage she had lost, and none of them could have imagined that the sealed envelope resting inside her purse contained the first proof that the past everyone pitied was about to become the future no one expected. The applause inside the ballroom gradually faded as the giant screen behind Ethan shifted to the logo of Bennett Development, but Claire barely noticed. Her thoughts drifted to another evening exactly 3 weeks earlier, when an overnight envelope had arrived at the modest townhouse she rented on a quiet tree-lined street outside the city. The return address belonged to Holloway and Pierce, one of the oldest law firms in New York, a name she recognized only because William Ashford's companies had appeared beside it countless times in financial magazines. She had assumed the envelope had been delivered to the wrong address, until she saw her full name printed neatly across the front. Inside was a single cream-colored letter requesting her presence at a private legal proceeding that would take place immediately following Bennett Development's investor gala. There was no explanation, no list of documents to bring. Only one sentence seemed unusually important. Your attendance is required in person. Confidentiality is essential. Claire read the letter 3 times before carefully placing it back inside the envelope. She had considered calling the law office, but the document included no direct phone number, only the signature of Margaret Holloway, senior partner. For several days she convinced herself there had been some kind of administrative mistake. Then a second envelope arrived, identical to the first except for one additional sentence. This notice is not an error. Please trust that your presence matters. She had not told anyone. There was no one left who would understand why the letters unsettled her more than they excited her. The few friends who remained from her old life assumed she was quietly rebuilding after the divorce. Her co-workers at the neighborhood bookstore knew nothing about billionaires, prestigious law firms, or mysterious invitations. Claire preferred it that way. She had learned that peace often arrived only after people stopped expecting explanations. On the morning of the gala, she opened her closet and ignored the expensive dresses she had never found a reason to sell after her marriage ended. Instead, she chose the simple ivory dress she had worn only once before, paired with comfortable heels and the small silver necklace Ethan had given her during happier years. She almost removed the necklace before leaving home, then quietly decided against it. It no longer represented a promise between two people. It reminded her of the woman she had once been, someone capable of believing in impossible futures without asking for anything in return. The drive into the city took just under 40 minutes. Traffic crawled through downtown while skyscrapers reflected the orange glow of sunset across the windshield. Claire parked several blocks away instead of using the valet service. The walk gave her time to steady her breathing before entering the luxury hotel where two invitations had unexpectedly led her to the same place at the same hour. She had expected awkward conversations with Ethan. She had expected whispers from strangers who remembered the divorce. She had even expected Vanessa's carefully polished insults. What she had not expected was the strange certainty growing inside her with every step she took through the revolving doors, as though the unopened envelope resting inside her purse had already begun changing the direction of her life before anyone had spoken a single word. Back in the ballroom, a hotel employee approached Margaret Holloway near the front row and quietly handed her a sealed leather portfolio. The distinguished attorney glanced toward the rear of the room, found Claire standing exactly where the letter had instructed, and offered the smallest, almost invisible nod before taking her seat, while Claire realized with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen had never depended on Ethan inviting her at all. Margaret Holloway remained perfectly still near the front row, her leather portfolio resting unopened on her lap while executives continued congratulating Ethan as if the evening had already reached its highest point. None of them noticed that the most influential person in the ballroom had not spoken a single word since arriving. Claire watched quietly from the back of the room, recognizing the attorney from newspaper photographs but remembering someone else entirely. Nearly 4 years earlier, long before mysterious envelopes and confidential invitations, her mornings had followed a rhythm that no longer resembled the life she had shared with Ethan. She opened the neighborhood bookstore before sunrise, switched on the warm reading lamps one by one, brewed fresh coffee for the small corner cafe, and greeted regular customers by name. It was a simple life, measured by the turning of pages instead of business headlines, and although the paycheck barely covered rent, every evening she returned home with a kind of peace money had never promised. One rainy autumn afternoon, an elderly gentleman stepped inside carrying an umbrella that had surrendered to the wind. His jacket was damp, his expression tired, and he wandered through the history section longer than anyone else that day. Claire noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a book on the highest shelf. Without saying anything dramatic, she retrieved it and offered him a dry towel from behind the counter. He thanked her with genuine gratitude instead of practiced politeness. That was how William Ashford first entered her life, not as one of the wealthiest men in America, but as a quiet customer searching for a forgotten biography. He never introduced himself. Claire never asked. During the following months he returned every Thursday afternoon, always ordering the same cup of black coffee and reading beside the window overlooking the small park across the street. They discussed books, American history, architecture, and sometimes the strange loneliness that could exist even in crowded cities. William listened more than he spoke. Claire never treated him differently because she did not know there was any reason to do so. One winter morning she arrived to find him sitting outside on a frozen bench after slipping on an icy sidewalk. He insisted he was fine, but she ignored his pride, helped him inside, called his physician, and stayed until someone arrived to take him home. Before leaving, he smiled and asked why she had spent so much time helping a stranger. Claire answered with a quiet honesty that surprised even herself. She said kindness only counted when it expected nothing in return. From that day forward, their conversations grew longer. Sometimes William asked for recommendations. Sometimes he simply enjoyed the silence between two people who had both learned that life could change without warning. Claire never mentioned her failed marriage. William never mentioned board meetings or private jets. Their friendship existed beyond titles and fortunes. Back in the ballroom, Ethan continued shaking hands beneath the bright lights while reporters captured every confident smile. He believed the room belonged entirely to him because every camera pointed in his direction. What he could not see was Margaret Holloway carefully opening the leather portfolio for the first time. She removed several neatly organized documents, placed them in precise order, and glanced once more toward Claire. There was respect in that brief look, the kind earned over years rather than purchased in an afternoon. Claire gently rested one hand against the unopened envelope inside her purse and took a slow breath, unaware that within the next few minutes the quiet friendship that had begun beside a bookstore window was about to rewrite every assumption inside the ballroom. The string quartet fell silent as technicians adjusted the presentation screen, and for the first time that evening the ballroom was filled not with music, but with the quiet murmur of expensive conversations. Claire remained near the back, unnoticed by most of the guests, exactly where she preferred to be. Years earlier, William Ashford had once told her that the loudest people in any room were rarely the ones changing the future. At the time she had smiled politely, assuming it was simply another thoughtful observation from an older man who loved books more than attention. She understood those words differently now. Their friendship had never been built on grand gestures. It grew through ordinary afternoons that slowly became extraordinary memories. Every Thursday, William appeared with another worn hardcover tucked beneath his arm. Sometimes he asked Claire to recommend novels he had somehow never found time to read. Other afternoons they debated American history over steaming cups of black coffee, while rain tapped softly against the bookstore windows. He never mentioned board meetings. He never boasted about achievements. To Claire, he was simply a thoughtful gentleman who listened carefully before speaking. During one particularly cold December, William stopped visiting for nearly 3 weeks. Claire found herself glancing toward the front door every Thursday without realizing it. Then one snowy afternoon, a black sedan quietly parked outside the bookstore. A professional driver entered carrying a handwritten note, asking whether Miss Claire Bennett would be willing to visit an elderly friend recovering from pneumonia. She closed the store early without hesitation. William welcomed her with an embarrassed smile from his favorite reading chair, surrounded by shelves that stretched from polished hardwood floors to towering ceilings. Only then did Claire begin to realize that the quiet man she had known lived inside one of the most remarkable estates she had ever seen. Even so, nothing about him had changed. He still asked about new books before discussing his own health. He still laughed gently whenever Claire insisted he should rest instead of working. Over the following months she visited regularly, bringing homemade soup, library books, and crossword puzzles that he stubbornly claimed he could finish faster than she could. Employees throughout the estate greeted her with growing familiarity. They respected her because William clearly did. One spring afternoon he finally admitted the truth she had never bothered to discover on her own. He was William Ashford, founder of Ashford Global Holdings. Claire looked at him for several quiet seconds before asking if he still wanted the mystery novel she had promised to bring the following week. William laughed harder than she had ever heard before. From that day forward, their conversations changed very little. She refused to treat him differently because wealth had never been the reason she cared whether he was lonely. One evening, while watching the sunset color the gardens outside his library, William asked whether she regretted everything she had lost after her divorce. Claire answered honestly that losing comfort had hurt, but losing herself would have hurt far more. William never forgot that sentence. Back inside the ballroom, Ethan accepted another round of applause as photographers crowded closer to the stage. Vanessa slipped her hand around his arm, smiling confidently as reporters documented what everyone assumed was the city's newest power couple. Neither of them noticed Margaret Holloway quietly standing from her chair. The attorney closed the leather portfolio with calm precision before exchanging a brief glance with 2 senior partners waiting near the side entrance. Hotel staff began rearranging several chairs at the front of the ballroom, a small change that seemed insignificant to everyone except Claire. She recognized the subtle shift immediately. The celebration Ethan believed he controlled was quietly transforming into an entirely different gathering, one that had never been organized to honor his success at all. The ballroom lights softened as hotel staff rolled a polished oak podium onto the center of the stage. At first, most guests assumed another executive presentation was about to begin. Conversations continued over the sound of crystal glasses and quiet laughter. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his jacket, exchanged a confident smile with Vanessa, and nodded towards several investors who had already congratulated him on what they believed would become the biggest partnership of his career. Everything appeared perfectly under control. Then Margaret Holloway walked toward the microphone. She did not rush. She did not smile. Her calm presence carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who had no interest in impressing anyone because the facts alone would soon command the room. The conversations gradually faded until only the soft hum of the air conditioning remained. Margaret thanked the hotel staff for accommodating an unexpected legal proceeding immediately following the scheduled corporate event. A few puzzled expressions appeared across the audience. Ethan glanced toward one of his assistants, assuming there had been a minor scheduling misunderstanding. The assistant merely shrugged. Margaret continued by explaining that, under the instructions of the late William Ashford, a confidential reading of legal documents would take place before a carefully selected group of witnesses. The name alone transformed the atmosphere. Investors straightened in their seats. Reporters quietly lowered their voices. Several executives instinctively reached for their phones before remembering they had agreed to place them on silent upon entering the ballroom. Ethan's confident smile returned. He had spent months hoping Bennett Development might eventually earn the attention of Ashford Global Holdings. If William Ashford's estate was making an announcement in the same room, perhaps fate had unexpectedly favored him. Vanessa leaned closer and whispered that this could become the opportunity of a lifetime. Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off the stage. Claire remained exactly where she had been all evening. She neither stepped forward nor attempted to draw attention to herself. Her fingers rested gently against the sealed envelope inside her purse, feeling the textured paper beneath the leather, as though reminding herself that everything unfolding around her was real. She remembered William's final visit to the bookstore nearly 8 months earlier. His movements had been slower, but his eyes had carried the same quiet warmth. Before leaving, he had thanked her for treating him like an ordinary man during years when almost everyone else saw only his fortune. Claire had laughed softly and replied that ordinary kindness should never depend on extraordinary wealth. William had looked at her for a long moment before saying that character always revealed itself when nobody expected a reward. Those words echoed inside her mind as Margaret opened the leather portfolio and arranged several official documents across the podium. 2 additional attorneys joined her on stage, followed by a licensed notary public who verified the sealed paperwork before the witnesses. Every step unfolded with careful precision. There was no drama, only procedure, and somehow that made the moment even more powerful. Ethan folded his arms with growing anticipation. He imagined announcements about charitable foundations, corporate restructuring, or investment opportunities that ambitious developers like himself might one day pursue. Around the ballroom, whispers spread from table to table as guests speculated about heirs, board members, and billion-dollar assets. No one looked toward the quiet woman standing near the back wall, because no one believed she belonged in a conversation about one of America's greatest business empires. Margaret finally lifted the first document, adjusted her glasses, and slowly scanned the audience before allowing her eyes to settle on Claire for only a heartbeat. Then she spoke a single sentence that caused every curious whisper in the ballroom to disappear at once. Before the estate of William Ashford can be distributed, the individual named in his final personal declaration must be formally acknowledged in the presence of every witness assembled here. No one moved. Even the waiter standing beside silver serving carts seemed frozen as Margaret Holloway unfolded the first page with deliberate care. The silence inside the ballroom became so complete that the faint ticking of a decorative clock near the entrance suddenly sounded loud. Margaret raised her eyes and spoke with the calm precision that had defined decades inside courtrooms and boardrooms. She explained that William Ashford had prepared a personal declaration separate from his corporate will, insisting it be read before any distribution of his estate could legally begin. Every witness present would hear the exact words without alteration. Ethan straightened his posture. Vanessa folded her hands together, unable to hide her excitement. Around them, investors leaned forward, convinced they were about to witness the naming of an influential executive or a respected member of the Ashford family. Margaret began reading. William's words carried remarkable warmth for a legal document. He wrote that true wealth was never measured by buildings, stock certificates, or private aircraft. It was measured by the character of the people trusted to protect them after he was gone. He admitted that during the final years of his life, he had met countless successful individuals who admired his fortune, yet only one person had consistently treated him as though he were simply another human being deserving of friendship. Several guests quietly exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan listened politely but struggled to understand why such personal reflections were being shared during what he assumed would become a corporate announcement. Margaret continued reading. William described afternoons inside a neighborhood bookstore, conversations over black coffee, thoughtful debates about history, and acts of kindness offered without expectation of recognition. He recalled rainy days, winter afternoons, handwritten book recommendations, and a woman who never once asked him for influence, introductions, or financial assistance. Claire lowered her eyes as each memory returned with quiet clarity. She could almost smell the fresh coffee drifting through the little bookstore, and hear William laughing after losing another crossword challenge. Across the ballroom, curiosity slowly replaced confidence. Vanessa glanced toward Ethan as if expecting him to explain the story. He simply shook his head. Margaret turned another page. William wrote that the woman he trusted most had experienced disappointment, without allowing bitterness to define her. She had lost comfort but preserved compassion. She had been underestimated by people who judged success through appearances instead of integrity. Those words seemed to settle over the ballroom like invisible snow. Then Margaret paused. She looked toward the back of the room exactly where Claire stood alone. Her voice remained steady as she read the next sentence. The individual described in this declaration is Claire Bennett. For a heartbeat, nobody reacted. It was as though the name itself needed time to travel through hundreds of astonished thoughts. Ethan blinked once, convinced he had misunderstood. Vanessa turned sharply toward Claire, her confident smile disappearing for the first time that evening. Soft whispers spread through the ballroom. Some guests looked from Claire to Margaret, then back again, searching for signs of an impossible mistake. Margaret allowed the silence to settle before continuing. She confirmed that Claire Bennett had been personally identified by William Ashford as the individual whose judgment, honesty, and compassion earned his complete confidence. This declaration, she explained, was not symbolic. It was legally binding and served as the foundation for every instruction contained within the remaining estate documents. Ethan slowly lowered his arms. The certainty that had surrounded him all evening quietly began to disappear. He looked toward Claire expecting confusion, excitement, or triumph. Instead, she stood exactly as before, her hands resting calmly around her purse, her expression gentle and composed. She neither celebrated nor defended herself because she had never come seeking anyone's approval. Margaret carefully placed the first document aside before reaching for the sealed envelope resting beneath it. She broke the official wax seal, unfolded the final pages, and looked once more across the silent ballroom. Then she announced that William Ashford's declaration had only established whom he trusted. The next document would reveal everything he had chosen to place in that person's hands. Margaret Holloway unfolded the final pages with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout the evening, yet the atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. Nobody whispered now. Nobody reached for another drink. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the woman standing quietly near the back of the room. Claire did not step forward. She did not attempt to explain herself. She simply waited, trusting the man who had once told her that truth never needed to compete with noise. Margaret began reading William Ashford's final instructions. He declared that every decision contained within the estate had been made after years of careful consideration rather than emotion. He explained that business success required intelligence, but preserving a legacy required character. He had searched for someone who understood both responsibility and compassion. After years of observation, he had found that person in Claire Bennett. The words settled over the audience with astonishing weight. Ethan stared toward the stage, his confident expression slowly giving way to disbelief. Vanessa instinctively tightened her grip around his arm before quietly letting go altogether. Margaret continued without changing her tone. William directed that the controlling ownership of Ashford Global Holdings, together with its voting authority, executive oversight, philanthropic foundation, private investment offices, and every personal estate specifically listed within the accompanying legal documents, would pass to one individual. She paused only long enough for the silence to deepen before speaking the name once again. Claire Bennett. An audible breath swept across the ballroom. Several executives looked toward one another, convinced they had misunderstood the legal language. A reporter lowered his notebook, momentarily forgetting to write. Two investors exchanged stunned expressions after realizing the transfer represented far more than extraordinary wealth. It represented control. Ethan's face lost its color. Only minutes earlier he had imagined introducing himself to representatives of the Ashford organization as an ambitious developer seeking future partnerships. Now he understood that every opportunity he had hoped to pursue would ultimately answer to the woman he had dismissed as part of his past. Vanessa finally whispered, almost to herself, that it could not possibly be true. Margaret immediately lifted another certified document, bearing multiple official seals and signatures. She calmly explained that every instruction had already completed the required legal review and would become effective according to the terms established by William Ashford before his passing. There would be no uncertainty regarding his intentions. There would be no competing claims presented that evening. Claire remained perfectly still. She remembered the final afternoon she had spent inside William's library. He had looked out across the gardens and quietly admitted that buildings eventually aged, markets always changed, and fortunes could disappear overnight, but integrity appreciated with time if someone chose never to abandon it. She had smiled, believing he was simply sharing another lesson from a remarkable life. She had never imagined those words were preparing her for this moment. Margaret invited Claire to approach the stage. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly across the polished marble floor, as the crowd instinctively parted to create a clear path. No one laughed now. No one whispered about her simple dress. The same people who had overlooked her only an hour earlier watched with quiet respect as she accepted the leather portfolio from Margaret with both hands. Claire did not raise it in celebration. She did not look toward Ethan. Instead, she gently placed one hand across the cover for a brief moment, as though silently thanking the friend who had trusted her beyond measure. Standing only a few yards away, Ethan realized the greatest loss of his life had never been a marriage that ended. It had been failing to recognize the extraordinary woman standing beside him long before the rest of the world finally did. Claire accepted the leather portfolio with quiet gratitude before closing it gently, as though it contained something far more valuable than legal documents. Around her, the ballroom remained suspended between disbelief and admiration. Reporters who had spent the evening chasing Ethan's success slowly lowered their cameras before turning every lens toward the woman they had barely noticed when she first entered the room. Claire did not rush toward the stage lights. She did not celebrate. She simply thanked Margaret Holloway with a sincere smile, the same kind of smile she had once offered every customer who stepped into a small neighborhood bookstore. Ethan finally found the courage to take a few hesitant steps forward. The confident executive who had commanded the room less than an hour earlier now looked like a man searching for words that no longer existed. He stopped several feet away from Claire, aware that every guest was watching. His voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard before as he congratulated her, and admitted that he had never imagined this outcome. Claire met his eyes without anger. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only calm acceptance. She thanked him politely and wished him success in the future. Nothing more. That brief exchange carried greater weight than any argument ever could. Vanessa remained silent beside him, realizing that the elegance she had worn all evening could not disguise the discomfort of standing on the wrong side of someone else's story. The ballroom doors opened as members of the Ashford executive team entered one by one. Instead of surrounding Claire with dramatic applause, they greeted her with respectful handshakes. Each person addressed her by name, acknowledging the legal authority William Ashford had entrusted to her. Their professionalism transformed the atmosphere completely. Claire was no longer the forgotten guest standing in the back of the room. She was the person entrusted with protecting one of the most respected business legacies in America. Margaret quietly handed Claire a small velvet box that had been included among William's personal instructions. Inside rested an old brass bookstore key attached to a worn leather keychain. Beneath it lay a handwritten note in William's familiar script. It read, "Never forget where the greatest investment was made. It was never in my companies. It was in your heart." Claire closed the box slowly, holding it with both hands for a moment before slipping it carefully into her purse beside the unopened silver necklace she had carried through every chapter of her life. As guests gradually stepped aside, she walked toward the ballroom exit. No security guards cleared her path. No announcement demanded attention. People simply moved because genuine respect required no instructions. Outside, the cool evening air carried the distant sounds of the city she had quietly rebuilt her life within. A black sedan waited near the entrance, but before stepping inside, Claire looked once toward the skyline glowing beneath thousands of lights. She thought about the tiny apartment where dreams had once begun, the bookstore where kindness had quietly changed 2 lives, and the friend who had seen her true worth long before anyone else did. She understood then that William Ashford had not given her a future. He had recognized the future she had already earned through compassion, patience, and unwavering dignity. The ballroom behind her continued buzzing with astonished conversations, yet none of those voices followed her into the night. Claire entered the waiting car without looking back, because the chapter she had lost no longer defined the story she was living. She had never returned to reclaim the man who overlooked her. She had returned to discover that the life waiting ahead was greater than anything she had left behind. She did not win because she inherited an empire. She inherited an empire because she had already become the kind of person worthy of protecting one.